that interested in describing, they weren't that interested in giving local details. They were interested in giving a general impression of the province. And so the general impression is there are some of the indigenous people who are more like us and some who are less like us. And the ones who are more like us have certain characteristics, and the ones who are less like us have other characteristics. So for example, in Yunnan Prefecture, this is the provincial gazetteer. It says that there's a prefecture gazetteer that says that the local customs are substantially savage, and the character of the people is stupid and stubborn. The Tuan and the Bo are the two most abundant kinds. So in this case, the implication is that the point of comparison is Min in other parts of the empire, right? The normal, uneducated people who are less ungovernable, less savage, and also less stubborn. But Tuan and Bo here, they go together. But in other places, they're apart or contrasted with each other. So in the 1445 gazetteer in Chujing, it says, in this place, Han and Yi coexist. Those who live arrayed near the prefecture, garrison, and towns are mostly Han, Bo, and military colonists. And then it proceeds to describe the festivals and the medical practices, mainly, of these types of people. And then it says the Lolo, who are also called Tuan, are divided into white and black. So there's white Lolo and black Lolo, and then it describes they live further from the prefecture towns and garrisons and so on, but they come to the market sometimes, but mostly they live in the mountains. They just come in and trade. So in this case, the structure of the list of peoples who live in Chujing is the basis of the comparison, but there's also explicit comparative language. And there's more in this local gazetteer from Xundian, which is around the same part of eastern Yunnan. So in this case, it says the types of subjects in this that the prefecture governs are not all the same. There are Han people, Bo people, Sumu people, also called Huihui, so that means the descendants of Central Asians, mostly Muslim. Black Lolo, White Lolo, also called Black Tuan and White Tuan, for which it cites the Yunnan Gazetteer, and Tian Lolo. So as you can see, the same categories are being used for these groups of people, even though they're not necessarily speaking the same language or related in a way that we would consider to be important. The Han people here and the Bo people here are the same as those in Yunnan Prefecture, in dress, material items, wedding and funeral customs, and sacrifices. Their nature is cunning, adaptable, and fearless. It's also from the Yunnan Gazetteer. So the two important things about this passage. The first one is the fact it does a comparison to those in Yunnan Prefecture. And in a lot of the provincial gazetteers, what you find is that there will be a description of customs throughout the province at the beginning of the gazetteer, and then the later ones will just refer back. They'll say, okay, well, in these regards, it's the same as the one we said at the beginning, so you can just take that, and then here's some local variants. The other important point here is the use of dress, material items, wedding and funeral customs, and sacrifices as the important points of comparison. And this is also pretty common in most of the gazetteers, that we look at these set phrases, especially wedding and funeral customs, sacrifices and rituals. They appear and reappear as reference points for describing, or as the grounds of comparison, for making a comparison in this case. And so the last one is white law are largely the same as black law, only their speech is a little different. So we've just had a long description of the practices of the black law, and then there's a little line that says, this other kind of law, they're basically the same, but they have a different accent. It's interesting because normally they don't talk about speech, but because this is a local a local gazetteer and it's compiled by someone who actually lived in this place, has become relevant information to include in the comparison. And so that highlights another point about these two paradigms that I have in mind. So in general, the purpose is the more general comparisons between Xuan and Bo and citizens are they're ahistorical. That's the same in both. They're based on customs. That's the same in both. They're not location specific. They don't. It doesn't matter which prefecture you're in. You'll probably find some of each. But they're more often found in provincial level gazetteers. But it's a sliding scale. So the Bo and Xuan can be more or less civilized in each place, depending on what the standards of that place are. On the other hand, the kind of gazetteers that list more as by the end of the dynasty, we have there's one that says there are 70 types of Xuan and 90 types of Bo, and then it proceeds to list them for like 10 pages. But those are location specific, so each place will get a different name for the people that live there. And this is where they start including language as well as customs. And you more often find them in local gazetteers like this one, because those are the people with the information. But by the end of the dynasty, you find them in both at the very beginning and at the very end of this period. You find them in provincial gazetteers as well. But it's important to keep in mind that these are not rigidly kept separate necessarily. In a lot of quite a lot of gazetteers include both ways of making comparisons. So this example with the use of the speech is to differentiate two different types of law is one, and then using Xuan and Bo as the general categories of which there are subcategories is another way in which they're integrated later. Okay, so having identified these two forms of comparisons that are frequently made, I want to look at a little bit more at who is making these comparisons. So in the city of Dali, because although most of the examples of the gazetteers, as you might remember, are from edited by people who were from elsewhere, by the middle of the 16th century, some indigenous men from Yunnan, specifically from the former noble families of Dali, had been classically educated, were serving as officials, were successful in the examinations, as distinct from attempting to take the examinations. And so they began to have the leisure and the resources and the interest to write these kinds of texts about themselves. Most people in Yunnan, most of the indigenous elite in Yunnan were either not interested in doing this because they were in the Tusa system, and so they achieved power via the structures of indirect rule. But in Dali, because it was directly administered, it was necessary to use the civilian administration to maintain their status. So here's a map of Yunnan with Dali in the northwest, and Kunming is the provincial capital from the time that the Mongols moved the capital there from Dali. Whereas the southern parts were the parts that were mostly occupied by people using the Tusa, governed by the Tusa system. So the first provincial gazetteer compiled by a retired literatus from Dali was the 1574 Comprehensive Yunnan Gazetteer, compiled by Li Yuanyang, who was a Jinshi from 1516, something like that, and then served as a local official, a magistrate in Yunnan, and then after his retirement, he came back to Delhi and became involved with a circle of friends, including some famous literati who'd been exiled for political reasons, and also some his family members, his brother, his classmates from his childhood. And these men drove the production of texts in Delhi in this period pretty substantially. So this first quote from his 1574, he compiled a Delhi Gazetteer, which is mostly no longer extant, and also this provincial gazetteer, in which he frequently quotes his own notebooks and also notebooks of his friends. So he tends to be pretty clear about when the information that he's using comes from somewhere else. And so this is from the last section entitled the Treatise on Halter and Bridle Prefectures. As you can see, he includes in here 2 sections on the customs of the Or, also called E, and the customs of the Tuan, also called Man. What is interesting is that he frames, the contents of these sections is fairly standard, but he frames them in instead of leaving them in an ahistorical discussion of the geography, he puts them into this separate treatise in which he also talks about the tax obligations, the Tibetan, the neighboring Tibetan state, which was at this point independent and had, during the period of the Nanjao Kingdom, been quite actively rivaling the Tang dynasty for supremacy in the region. And then in these short historical accounts of the Nanjao Kingdom, which ruled from the 7th to the 10th centuries in Yunnan, the Bai Kingdom, which preceded that, and the Dian Kingdom, which preceded that. And then also he adds at the end selected sayings from histories and traditions, which means these are excerpts from the classical texts, the Chinese classical texts that talk about Yunnan. And so what he's doing here is framing the customs in terms of, or in the context of, both narrative accounts of history and also in terms of the Chinese literary historical tradition. These 2 things are things that he does in other parts of the Gazetteer. So this is the little chapter preface to the Jimizhi. He says, Yuan scholar Li Jing, who compiled the 1331 Provincial Gazetteer, recorded the crudity of barbarian customs, but what we see nowadays in no way resembles that. So knowing the inner nature of the barbarians, there is no difference between Hua and Yi, that is, between the efflorescent and the barbarian, as far as the beneficial influence of the sovereign goes. Do we even have to think about whether a place is far or near? Therefore, when I made a treatise on the Jimmy to record a general idea of, their customs in order that we may see prosperity in the 4 corners of the land. So here he's framing Yunnan as part of the empire, number 1, but he's also refusing to make a distinction between the ritual acceptability of the Yi, the barbarians, and the Hua, which is the more civilized people. He's also doing this by practicing, using historical practices, using intertextual reference to emphasize his participation in this tradition of historical writing. So he explicitly quotes Li Jing, or explicitly references Li Jing, and then he also uses this term Bing Yi in, it's not important, which is 2 characters which are not commonly used in Chinese in this period, but they are a reference to the classic poetry, which is one of the pre-imperial texts that was part of the most narrow definition of the canon, and one of the having a full classical education would mean that he had memorized this text, and being able to quote from it is a marker of being able to participate fully in this tradition. He also does this in his sections on Feng Shui that we were looking at before. He begins them by citing all the texts that he can think of that are relevant. And in fact, I can only find one of these in the in the texts that he cites. He says that they are from, and that one is taken completely out of context. However, the point of using them is to rhetorically situate the local customs within a historicized, literate, in classical Chinese tradition. And I have one more example from a later gazetteer, the one that we looked at the picture of before. It's interesting because this gazetteer, first in the customs section, it does not include much in the way of, it separates the local customs from the categories of people that live there. So it engages in the naming practices separately from the description of customs, which is more like what you would do in, the description of customs doesn't look much different from what it would look like anywhere else in the empire. He says, even at the beginning of the dynasty, the customs were those of the variae. Latterly, the number of examination graduates has continually increased, and the literary works and virtuous deeds can be compared with those in the central provinces. So here he's also, in addition to making a structural change, he's making an explicit comparison with the central provinces, and also a temporal comparison with, which you notice that Li Yuanyang also did, between the state of things now and the state of things in the past. So even though this place might not have been civilized, now it is. And then he has a separate section in which he discusses he outlines a series of categories that are completely unlike any of the other sets of categories, except that he includes Swan and Bo at the end. But he says the Turan, the local people, are Bayads. They're not, he describes the local people not as Swan and Bo are a separate set of categories. Swan are indigenous, but they live in the mountains, and the Boran are people who came here from Sichuan as slaves. And they have the same characteristics that that Bo are typically described to have, being, relatively gentle and not likely to rob you or raise a rebellion, but also not being completely, not living in the same way that normal citizens would live. So, I have, the three general interesting points that I thought might be abstractable for discussion for other contexts. In this case, when the indigenous literati are engaging in practices of comparison, they use the dominant paradigms to do it. Because they are writing in Chinese, because they are literati, because they are part of this official government, they use the paradigms of the official government, and they use the genres and they use the language that are normative throughout the empire. They don't really adjust them often, but they do introduce additional material, mainly historical material, in order to contextualize or slightly reframe the categories that are regularly existing, and they generally are more positive about themselves, strangely. And finally, the way they do it, the fact of their being able to use the practices, is a way of framing themselves as part of the being the same kind of people as the people who rule in the center. So they're primarily marking their class status as literati and members of the scholar official or scholar gentry status group. Thank you.